Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Gabriel Marcel's essay, Concrete Approaches to Investigating the Ontological Mystery, there is a brief discussion of a term that we translate as recollection and its relation with another term that we translate as assurance, which in the French is just assurance. Recollection, receuillement, has a number of different senses that we're going to get into in a moment. And interestingly enough, in the course of this, Marcel actually brings up the English expression to recollect oneself and says that it's very revealing. And this is important in part because it's something that Marcel thinks that human beings ought to do. It's a way of staking oneself ontologically and existentially. But it's also important for understanding what he's been laying out in this, the notion of mystery or metaproblematic. And he tells us that it's rather difficult to define, and he tells us as well that this is one reason why professional philosophers have given very little attention to recollection. He tells us why it's difficult to define, and then he provides us with what might be viewed as his own attempt at definition of it. He does also, at the very end of this section of the essay, register a certain annoyance, an annoyance with, as he calls it, using abstract language when dealing with something that isn't quite so easily approached through the abstract language, and where there's a danger of mistaking the terms for the actual ontological or existential experiences and realizations. He also wants to resist reducing this just down to experiences, as we're going to see. So he tells us it's most annoying to have to use such abstract language when in truth one is dealing not with a dialectic ad usum philosophorum, that means a dialectic for the uses or customary dealings of philosophers, that is professional philosophers, but with what is most vital, and that's an interesting thing right there. We should pause on that for a second. Is this an opposition between the abstract, book-bound way of doing things that philosophers, except for maybe Marcel, is engaged with, and then we've got life and vitality and another kind of philosophy, vitalism over here. He brings up Henri Bergson as an example of somebody in this essay. No, because Marcel is going to go beyond this. It isn't just about life and lived experience versus, abstract ideas. He goes on to say, with what is most vital, and I will say most dramatic. Drama is incredibly important for Marcel, the dramatic dimension. But he also says, dramatic in what sense? In the rhythm of a consciousness seeking to be conscious of itself, to become conscious of itself, which is never something that is carried out all at once. It's a continual process which has setbacks and, we might say, successes that then have to be built upon, where a person could take too much from that success and turn it into something like a ironclad method, and now we're back in abstract philosophy again. So Marcel is saying all of these reflections about recollection and assurance, we have to use the language of abstract ideas, but we don't want to remain confined to them. We don't want to remain stuck in them. So that said, by way of preamble, what sort of characterization does he provide? Well, he tells us that it transcends a certain dualism. He says that it's difficult to define, if only because recollection transcends the dualism between an act and a state of being. So we should talk about that for a moment. What do we mean? A state of being is a way in which we are, something we can describe about ourselves. Standing here before you, this is what Aristotle would call one of the accidental predicates, right? One of the categories, standing. That is both an act, but it's also describing the way in which I are. If I could say, okay, now I'm standing, I'm deliberately doing this, then it becomes an act, as opposed to say leaning or sitting down or standing on my head. Our minds are continually engaged in acts, and we commit ourselves through the acts we engage in. Thinking itself is an act. It is not something totally disconnected from action or from being. That's something that a lot of people lose sight of. They're like, well, you're locked up in your head. You've got all your thoughts. None of them are really real except for you. And then there's the outside world, and that's all these sort of static things that change every once in a while. And then there's actions between them. No, reality is way more complex than that when we embrace it in its concrete actuality. Actuality is not all act, we can say as well. It is also being and states of being. So there's a dualism here between act or action and being. And he says that in recollection, these two otherwise opposite aspects are reconciled. Isn't that interesting? A reconciliation is taking place. That doesn't mean that they simply become each other. You can't reconcile what simply fuse or are confused with each other. They still remain separate things, but they're reconciled with each other. And he goes on to characterize what recollection means. He says the word itself says what it means. Now, it's coming from cueillir, right? To gather. And there's also accueillir, to welcome. That's in the background, I would say, as a French word. So, recollement, right? The action of, whenever we have a re or re, that's always sort of, if coming from Latin, an intensification or a duplication of something. And so recollection implies that there is something to bring back together again. And what are we bringing back together? Well, he tells us recollection is essentially the act whereby I collect myself as a unity. Now, that's something very interesting to think about as well. Let's dwell on that sentence for just a moment. The act whereby I collect myself as a unity. So what was I before? A disunity? We experience that all the time. You walk into a room with the intention of picking something up and taking it into the other room, and by the time that you've gotten there, your mind is preoccupied with something else. It could be something you're thinking about that's on your mind, detaching you from the environment and your intentionality that you moved in there with. It could also be you see something else. I'm looking and I see candles and books and thinking, oh, maybe I should clean that up, right? And now suddenly you are no longer what you were coming in. And there's that, that there's something that you've forgotten you should do. So it's not as if you simply went from one state to the other, like changing a television channel where now the signal is totally different. No, there's still this lingering, haunting thing, and you're like, what did I come in here for? I mean, I know I got to do that thing over there. That's some new information. But what's going on? We can also talk about a person being a disunity in a moral sense. And sometimes this leads to them repressing things that they'd rather not think about, or lying to themselves in all sorts of ways. Recollection brings ourselves to ourselves in a unity, and it's not a completely stable or static unity either. It is a unity that we then have to take account of ourselves. And notice, again, what he's said in there, right? I collect myself. This is a reflexive way of speaking, right? I am the subject, collect myself. I am also, in a certain sense, the object, but not really the object, because I'm not reducible to an object. So there's a complicated action going on there. He also says, very importantly, that it's not just about concentrating the self, it's also about a certain kind of letting go. He says this is also a relaxation. It involves abandoning to, relaxing in the presence of, without it being possible for me to specify in any way the substantive reality that these prepositions refer to. The path stops, he says, in a very nice metaphor, at the threshold. So this is an experience that many of us have, and if you don't have it, you're still doing it at times as a human being. You're just not aware of it. You haven't recollected your recollection. Now, he talks about this within a context, and I think going a little bit backwards in the text can help us understand why he's bringing this up. He says that recollection is connected to the mystery or the metaproblematic, which is one of the main topics of this entire essay. So if we look at the previous paragraph before all of this begins, he says, the metaproblematical is still a content of thought. Why not inquire about its mode of existence as such? And so why don't we turn the metaproblematical into a set of ideas that we can explore? And he says, my response to this is as categorical as can be. To think the metaproblematic is to affirm it as indubitably real, as something I cannot doubt without contradiction. Now, notice he's not saying I can't doubt it at all. I can't engage in acts of doubting or skepticism or pessimism or whatever we want to say. But I can't do so without contradictions arising if I really think things through. I can't reduce the metaproblematical back down to the status of a problem to be solved, something that we can use techniques upon and then be done with, where we ourselves are not directly involved in it. He says, we are in a zone where it's impossible to disassociate the idea itself from the degree of certitude it carries. This idea is certitude. And here he brings up this important term again. It is assurance. It is its own assurance, right? To that extent, he says, it's something other and more than just an idea. We cannot put it at a distance and grapple with it in a purely abstract way, or else we lose sight of what it is that we're actually working on and our own involvement in it. Because the metaproblematic, the mystery, is something where not only has, as he tells us earlier, it encroaches upon its own data, but we are existentially involved in it. And so if we lose sight of that, we transform it into something else. Instead, because of that very feature of our own involvement, the inescapability of our involvement, it provides an assurance. Another way of translating assurance, guarantee, a vouching for, right? Now that doesn't mean that we couldn't be mistaken about things. It's not saying we have reached the Cartesian cogito or something like that. But there is something more going on here. And what allows us to have that assurance? Well, he says that a little bit later, this is going to tie in with recollection. But he also goes on and he says, moreover, the term content of thought, which figures in the objection, is deceptive, for a content is an extract derived from experience, whereas only an approach that detaches or liberates us from the experience enables us to rise to the level of the metaproblematical or of mystery. So we're not engaging in abstraction. We're not extracting something like its essence. We are instead engaging in something that distances ourselves from something and at the same time preserves the closeness and connection with that thing as well. So he talks about this as a real disengagement, a real disentangling, right? A real detachment, not an abstraction. What lets us do that? This is where we come to recollection. He says that it is in recollection, and in recollection alone, that this disengagement is accomplished. So recollection is something that is necessary for us to do in order to grasp individual mysteries, which are usually always connected with other mysteries, right? They're messy, they flow into each other, but also to understand the way that the mysterious or the metaproblematical works without distorting it into yet another set of problems. That is why he's looking at this idea of recollection. And he goes on, and he says that, I'm going to skip over his discussion of how the psychologist will turn it into a problem. He tells us that it's in the womb of recollection that I take a position, or more exactly, I put myself in a state that allows me to take a stand with regard to my life. So that's an important set of ideas there, right? It puts me into a state where I can take a stand. Who puts me in that state? I put myself into that state through, in some part, my own agency. Although, of course, we're going to find out that there's other agencies or at least instruments involved in the background. It's not totally up to me, right? And I put myself into a state where I can take a stand. Another way of talking about this is taking an existential position and having an existential realization. So he says, I withdraw from it in some way, but not as the pure knowing subject. Not a Cartesian subject, we could say. In this retreat, I bring with me what I am and what my life perhaps is not. We perceive the distance between my being and my life. I am not my life. And if I am able to judge it, he says, it's on the condition I can first of all encounter myself within recollection that is beyond all possible judgments. And I will add beyond any possible representation. Right? He says this process of recollection is not a looking at something, it is a retrieval, a renewal. And somebody might say, wow, that's really abstract by itself. What do all these terms mean? I am grasping who I am and what I am not, and what I, you might say, am and am not at the same time through this process of recollection in this state. He talks about encountering oneself in recollection. And here, Marcel is very, very good about providing examples throughout most of his works. He doesn't really provide us a lot of examples here, but we might dwell upon some, and I invite you to think about your own experiences that correspond to this. The realization in having regrets that you not only did something that maybe wasn't the best option, but seemed to be a good decision at the time, but that you broke a promise, let somebody down, let yourself down, didn't turn out to be the kind of person that you wanted to be. That's a possible experience of recollection where you take a stand upon yourself. You are at the same time the person making the judgment and the person judged. We could also do this with things where we're more happy about it, right? Thinking about our successes, but keeping them within perspective rather than allow it to rise to some sort of crazy, irrational elation that now thinks everything in the world is perfect, right? We encounter ourselves, we get to know ourselves better through recollection. We never do so as a complete totality. There's never a moment of total enlightenment where now we see everything as a whole, but we do it over and over and over again. So he also says, well, this sounds an awful lot like the dialectical moment of turning back to oneself, or the für sich sein, the being for oneself that is at the center of German idealism. Now, if you're not somebody conversant with German idealism, he's talking about, Hegel and other thinkers. Marcel himself was very into the German idealists when he was a younger person. He also read the American idealist Royce and did quite a bit of work on him. And he says, no, it's not the same thing as that. Why? He says, entering into oneself does not mean to be for oneself and to have in view some sort of intelligible unity of the subject and the object. Instead, we are in the presence of the paradox of mystery, whereby the self into which I return ceases precisely to that extent to belong to itself. So he's not saying here that it's a matter of lacking self-consciousness or insight into the self. He's saying what's missing here is the idea that the self doesn't just belong to the self, that it belongs to something else. It's connected with something. And he brings up this phrase coming from St. Paul, "You are not your own." He says this great statement conveys a significance that is both ontologically and essentially concrete. It is what best expresses the reality we're exploring at the moment. You know, sometimes we talk about something being bigger than ourselves and us belonging to that, and that would be one modality of that. But it could also be the realization that one doesn't just belong to oneself, but one also belongs to beings who are dependent upon one's children, one's students, one's parents, one's spouse, one's neighbors. It could be other things as well. These do not exhaust the possibilities. He also considers whether we should call this an intuition, and he's leery about the word intuition. He says, we have to be extremely prudent. If we can talk about an intuition, it's an intuition that is not or cannot be given as such. The more that an intuition is central, the more it fills up the depth of the being that it illumines, the less susceptible it is to reflect upon itself or to apprehend itself. This is kind of an issue with intuition. It presents itself, and he's not worried so much about the purely subjective side of intuition. Hey, what if I have different intuitions than you? He's saying intuition just doesn't actually reflect on itself. Instead, it's just bam, there it is, and it sort of floods you. That's not what recollection is, although we could certainly have intuitions within recollection, like, wow, I really screwed up there. That could be an intuition, right? So he goes on and he says, if we reflect beyond that to ask what an intuition of being might be, we see that it's not susceptible to a figure in a collection, to be cataloged. He goes on and he's got a great metaphor for this. To speak of an intuition of being is to invite us to play on a silent piano. Isn't that a great turn of phrase? Something worth thinking about. What does it mean to play on a silent piano? Well, there's keys there, and you can play all you want, but no sound comes out. Why not? Maybe the strings are gone. Or maybe it's just a magical piano and there's nothing to come out of it. Intuition, and the appeal to intuition and recollection is like that. So he says, instead of using the term intuition, we should say instead we have to deal with once again, assurance that underlies the development of thought, all thought, even discursive thought. He says, from this it follows we can only approach it through a movement of conversion. That is to say by, here's an important Marcellian term, secondary reflection. That reflection through which I ask myself in what way and on what basis the initial process of reflection was possible, which reflection itself postulated the ontological, but without realizing it. And he says this second reflection lets recollection become self-conscious to the extent that recollection can be thought. When Marcel brings up this term secondary reflection, anytime that we are sort of detaching ourselves from our experience and being, that is reflection by itself. It's usually a first reflection. It's analytic. It breaks things down. It separates things. Secondary reflection reunites. It's synthetic. And we are part of it. So we're not just this sort of sit-back spirit that's looking at all these things and putting them back together in a nice picture. We're in the picture. We're part of the picture. And not just us, but in our dramatic situation, which means with other beings as well, which makes it rather messy and complicated and muddy. But he thinks that this is central to what real recollection would be. So we have recollection, assurance, secondary reflection connected together. And these are all things that are not things, but rather processes or acts, states that allow us to apprehend the mystery or the metaproblematic as such.